Hey, friends. People are connecting to the audio, so I'll just give everyone a little bit of time to hop in. Seeing some familiar names from last week, so people were eager for part two, which is always nice.
Must be because I ended on a cliffhanger.
You left on a cliffhanger for sure. Well, we had so many people in the chat asking about skeptical science, so we'll just give it another admit all. Wow, it's hard to do all the things. Admit all. Um, all right. Well, I'll keep admitting people into the chat, or into the webinar, but I did want to go ahead and greet everyone and just introduce myself. So welcome to our webinar, Bust or Trust. This is the second of a two-part series on the scientific consensus on climate change, featuring our friend John Cook, co-founder of the website, or founder of the website. Sorry, I only gave you co-founder credits there. Skeptical Science. And so we will start off today's event, as we did last week, with a Q&A or a presentation from John. And then we'll follow that up with a Q&A. You can either raise your hand to answer your question, or you can drop it in the chat if you're feeling a little shyer tonight. And if you are unsure how to raise your hand, well, we have a little cheat sheet for you, so you can just raise your hand, and once we are moving to the Q&A, we will call on you. So hold back your questions until John is done, because last time I think we had some people who raised their hands early, and then John answered the questions as he went through his presentation. So with that, I will turn things over to John.
Great, thanks very much. Let me share my slides. Hopefully these should come up no problems. Okay, so today is part two. This is actually the first time I've ever done a two-part webinar series.
Same.
Um, but it kind of is appropriate. Like, in a sense, my research career has been these two parts. Like, the first chunk of it was, well, a lot of it was about quantifying the consensus. And then there was so much misinformation, a wave of misinformation in response to that work, that the rest of my career up to this point has really been about countering misinformation. So this is kind of like a life story in two parts. Now, last week, what I presented was a brief history of consensus, and the short version of that is that basically over what are we looking at? A decade and a half, there's been multiple studies that have attempted to quantify the level of scientific agreement that humans are causing global warming. And overwhelmingly, these studies find that there is overwhelming consensus. In other words, there is a consensus on consensus. Now, just to narrow in on my contribution to this set of studies, in 2013 we published a study finding 97% scientific consensus on climate change, and it really was after this paper was published and got a lot of attention that misinformation targeting the consensus really exploded. And I just want to, as a bit of a teaser of the rest of this webinar, just want to give you one example of the kind of response we saw. A week and a half after our paper came out in May 2013, the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed attacking our paper, saying that there was no consensus, there was no 97% consensus, and attacking our paper. And one thing that really jumped out at me, let me quickly go back to my slide, because it's important to point out who wrote this paper. There was myself. I was a researcher at the University of Queensland at the time, a climate communication research fellow. And it was a very much a international, interdisciplinary team with scientists working in a whole range of disciplines, chemistry, meteorology, geography, climate science, from universities all around the world. And so it was a really robust team of researchers um, who had and combined all these different disciplines, gave a very well-rounded um, set of expertise on climate change. But when the Wall Street Journal published this op-ed attacking our research, the way they characterized our paper was as me, a blogger, and some of my friends, which really gave the impression of a blogger deciding, hey, I'm going to write this paper, and just, hey, Bill, Fred, you want to help me write this paper? And yeah, really ad hominem attacking the authors in order to discredit our research, hiding the fact that it was actually a range of scientists from a range of relevant disciplines from universities all around the world. So this is an example of the type of misinformation that we see in climate change misinformation, ad hominem attack being one of the most common strategies being used. And I'll come back to this idea of identifying misinformation strategies later on. That's probably the main take home of today's talk. So if I summarize the history of misinformation in a very brief, concise way, misinformation about the scientific consensus on climate change, it really is a three-act story. The first act, the first thing that people heard about the scientific consensus was not my 97% paper. It wasn't Naomi Oreskes' 2004 consensus study. Before any of that, before any of the scientists had quantified the consensus, the first thing that the public heard about consensus was the argument that there was no consensus, that scientists disagreed, there was too much scientific uncertainty, and scientists didn't know whether humans were causing global warming. So that's really the first act in this brief history. And then papers like Naomi Oreskes' in 2004 and our study, 97% study in 2013, were really in response to that argument. They were saying there was no consensus, so our response was, well, let's fact check that. Let's actually quantify the consensus. And we found overwhelming agreement. And the response to that has been from the same people who said there was no consensus. Now they responded by saying, why are you talking about consensus? Science isn't decided by consensus. Really trying to shush us in fact checking their initial claims. So it's kind of, there's an irony to the arc of this debate in air quotes. And here's a timeline that shows just some of the type of misinformation campaigns, PR campaigns, statements and declarations that have been published over decades, designed to convey to the public the impression that scientists aren't either disagree or aren't sure about human-caused global warming, going right back into the 1980s. Where the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine published an article and quite deceptively published it, making it look like it was a article published in a prestigious scientific journal, but it was just a self-published article that they published, which was arguing that scientists disagreed. I want to highlight two points in this timeline. The first one is 1998. We saw then that, again, the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, who've been quite prolific in this area, in 1998, they published the Global Warming Petition Project. This was a website that featured a list of 31,000 or more than 31,000 American science graduates, so people who got a degree in some field of science, signing a statement saying that humans weren't disrupting climate. And the purpose of the Global Warming Petition Project was pretty straightforward. It was to argue that because so many science graduates had signed this statement that showed that there was no scientific consensus on climate change. The second, and I will come back to the Global Warming Petition Project and the kind of effect that type of misinformation has on people's perceptions and attitudes. I'll come back to that shortly. The second thing I wanted to point out was 2002. Um, in that year, a political strategist, Frank Luntz, published a strategy memo for politicians, giving them techniques and strategies on how to talk about climate change. And here is an excerpt from Frank Luntz's memo. This is really one of the key strategies he was advocating. He was saying that if the public come to believe that the scientific issues about climate change are settled, then their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, and here was his recommended action, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. In other words, he was saying, cast doubt on the scientific consensus. If the public think that the scientists disagree, then their attitude will shift on a whole range of issues to do with climate change, not just on whether there's scientific consensus, but on whether climate change is happening at all, and most importantly, whether they support policies to address climate change. Now, so this was Frank Luntz's memo in 2002. I should say, though, that since then, nowadays, Frank Luntz is actually working with organizations to promote climate action. It's almost like he's trying to undo some of the damage that his memo had done back in 2002. And he gets very cranky when people mention his 2002 memo. So, I mean, it was 2.5 decades ago now. So I guess we've all done things we regret. Back in the 1990s, I had a mullet. So, I've done things that I regret as well, but that probably didn't cause as much damage as the Luntz memo. And the thing is, his strategy was adopted. The scientific consensus, or attacking the scientific consensus, did become a major strategy within climate misinformation. There was an analysis of newspaper conservative op-eds that found that the most common climate myth in conservative op-eds over the period 2007 to 2010 was there is no scientific consensus. So attacking the consensus was the primary misinformation argument. Now, the other important thing to say is give credit where credit is due. Frank Luntz was way ahead of the curve. It wasn't till more than a decade later that social scientists came to the same conclusion as what Luntz did, although coming at it from the opposite point of view. And it was actually one of the co-authors of this research was Ed Maybach, who's based at George Mason University, where Republican is associated with. So he played a role in this formative research. What they found was when you communicate the consensus, that has a flow-on effect to a range of different attitudes and perceptions about climate change, such as whether global warming is happening, whether humans are causing it. And then that has a flow-on effect to whether people support policies to address climate change. So in other words, if you tell people 97% or more than 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, people respond with, oh, okay, well, I'm more accepting of the reality of climate change and that we need to do something about it. So there's a logic to it. But Frank Luntz was really coming at it from the opposite angle. He was saying cast doubt on the consensus, and then you reduce their belief in global warming and you reduce their support for climate policy. And unfortunately, Luntz was recommending this strategy in 2002, so 13 years before social scientists were publishing research saying, hey, this is actually quite important. What damage does misinformation about climate change and about the scientific consensus do? So we've already seen one example of the damage it does. It has this flow-on effect to various climate beliefs and policy support. But a study published in 2017, again, Ed Maybach was one of the co-authors of this, ran an experiment where they tested the impact of misinformation, and it has quite a subversive effect, quite damaging, uh, even more than just these flow-on effects. Now, what they did in this experiment was they had two messages. One message was the 97% consensus. The other message was the global warming petition project, casting doubt on the consensus. And in the experiment, they either showed people the 97% message or the petition project message or both. This was the results from the experiment. The first group, the first bar in this bar chart, were the people who were shown just the 97% consensus. And they found there was a strong increase in climate perceptions. Communicating the 97% consensus has a strong positive effect. The second group, or the second bar in this bar chart, were the group who were only shown the global warming petition project. And they found that the misinformation had a negative impact on people's climate perceptions. So it reduced people's perceived consensus and had other negative effects on other climate perceptions. So we see that facts have a positive effect, facts work, but misinformation has a negative effect. Misinformation also works. Where it gets really interesting and kind of disturbing is the third group in this experiment and the third bar in this bar chart, if you can call it a bar. These are the people who were shown both the fact and the misinformation. And what happened with this group was there was no change in belief. The two cancelled each other out. Fact and myth cancelled each other out. And so there was no change in people's perceptions. And what this tells us is that when people are presented with conflicting pieces of information and they have no way to resolve that conflict, then they cancel each other out. People disengage and they just don't believe either message. And this is one of the, I think, most subversive elements of misinformation. It doesn't have to be like the second bar in this bar chart where the misinformation causes people to believe wrong things. All misinformation has to do is stop the facts from having a positive effect. And essentially, they've done their job. And that's often the world that we find ourselves in. We often find that we are presented with conflicting pieces of information on social media and mainstream media, just talking to people. And if we don't have a way to resolve the conflict, resolve which is fact and which is myth, then we can just disengage and stop believing. It's a lot like those old episodes of Star Trek. Often I give this talk to university students, and they're like, Star Trek, like, this show from the 1960s. What are you talking about? And I'm thinking maybe this audience might be more aware of what I'm talking about. Sometimes Star Trek would have an episode where Captain Kirk gets cloned. There's a real Kirk, a fake Kirk, and Mr. Spock has to try to work out which is fake and which is real. Mr. Spock is the general public, trying to work out which is fake news and which is real news. But if the problem is that people have troubles resolving the conflict between fact and myth, that also points us towards the solution. We need to give people the tools to be able to resolve that conflict, to be able to discern factual information from misinformation. And a way to do that comes from a branch of psychological research called inoculation theory. Inoculation theory borrows the idea of vaccination, which has people being exposed to a weakened version of a virus so that they build up their immunity. Then when they encounter the actual virus, they're less likely to be infected. In the same way, in inoculation theory, when you expose people to a weakened version of misinformation that builds up their cognitive immunity, so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they're less likely to be misled. So, how do you deliver misinformation in a weakened form? There are two elements to an inoculating message. The first is warning people of the threat of being misled, just letting people know. It's like kind of, just to give you another 1960s television reference, it's kind of a Danger Will Robinson kind of message. There's misinformation out there that has the potential to deceive or mislead you. So there's the threat warning. And then the second element is counter arguments explaining how the misinformation misleads. Here's an example from the experiment, the 2017 experiment run by Sander van der Linden. What they did was they explained several ways that the global warming petition project was misleading. One way was it was an online survey. So initially, there was no quality control, and a lot of fake names were put onto the petition by pranksters, including Star Wars characters, members of the Spice Girls, who I don't think had American science degrees. I only know that because they're British, so I'm assuming that they don't have American science degrees, and people who had been dead for a long time. Secondly, 31,000 science graduates sounds like a lot of people, but there are millions of Americans with science degrees. So it's actually a tiny fraction of that large pool. But 31,000 sounds like a big number. And thirdly, because it was a degree in any field of science, the vast majority of them, more than 99%, had no expertise in climate science. It was computer scientists, engineering, medical science, veterinary science, a whole range of different areas of science, but very few were actually climate experts. So in this experiment, there was a fourth group where the participants were shown, firstly, the inoculation message. So the message explaining how the various ways that the global warming petition project misled people. Then it also showed them the facts, the 97% consensus, and the myth, the global warming petition project. And what they found then was that with the inoculation, then the facts were able to have a positive effect again. So most of the negative effect of the misinformation was neutralized. So inoculating people before they encounter misinformation can neutralize the misinformation. However, one challenge though is it's hard to inoculate people when you don't know what misinformation they're going to be exposed to. Like this inoculation message was specifically targeting the global warming petition project, but you don't really know what specific misinformation people might see. So purely by coincidence, I was running research at the same time as Van der Linden and Ed Maybach were doing their research. I had no idea they were doing theirs. They had no idea I was doing mine. I was in Australia at the time. And further by coincidence, I was looking at the same climate misinformation, the global warming petition project, which it turns out happens to be one of the most potent and effective pieces of climate misinformation out there. And what I was doing in my experiment was quite similar. I was showing people this misinformation, having them read about the global warming petition project, and then measuring the impact on their climate perceptions. And this is what I found. This graph shows the change in people's perceived consensus. So whether they thought there was a scientific consensus or not. The dotted line is zero, so no change. And anything below the dotted line means that their perception of consensus went down. So the misinformation had a negative impact on their perceptions. The horizontal axis in this graph is political ideology. So people who are to the right were more right-wing, people to the left are more left-wing. And what I found was climate misinformation doesn't have the same effect on everyone. Um, the more politically conservative people were, the more persuasive they found the misinformation. It's important to point out that this is not a general principle that applies to any misinformation, but specifically climate misinformation. So just putting that qualifier in there. But what this tells us is that climate misinformation is polarizing. It pulls the public apart. When climate misinformation washes over the public get further apart in their perceptions and attitudes about climate change. And that's the pattern we've seen over time too. We've seen that the public have gotten more polarized over time with regard to their attitudes about climate change and their perceptions about consensus. We see here that over time, the gap between Democrats and Republicans on perceived consensus has gotten further apart. And misinformation has been a contributor to that because of its polarizing influence. In my experiment, I divided participants up into two groups. One got just the misinformation, but another group was shown first an inoculating message. Here is an excerpt of the inoculation. And then they were shown the global warming petition project. Now, there was quite a big difference between my inoculation and the inoculation used in the previous experiment by Sander van der Linden. In my inoculation message, I didn't even mention the global warming petition project. Instead, it was much more general. And really what I focused on was the general technique, misleading technique of using fake experts to mislead people about scientific understanding. Fake experts are people who convey the impression of having expertise, but they don't have the actual relevant expertise. And the example I used in my inoculating message was actually in a completely different topic, using tobacco misinformation from the mid-20th century, using those old newspaper ads. It has a real Mad Men vibe about it. And so using a example from a different topic and explaining the general technique, people read this inoculation message and then they were shown the global warming petition project. And then I measured their climate perceptions. And the blue line here is the group who were inoculated before being shown the misinformation. Now, there's a slight slope to the line, but statistically, this line is like flat. Basically, the misinformation was neutralized across the political spectrum. It had no impact on anyone, whether they were to the left or to the right. And what this tells us is that everyone doesn't want to be misled. Being averse to being deceived is bipartisan. Whether you're liberal or conservative, nobody likes being tricked. And when you explain the techniques used to trick people, whether people are conservative or liberal, those tricks lose their teeth. They're less likely to mislead people. And so inoculating people, explaining misinformation techniques is a way to neutralize misinformation that would otherwise be polarizing. That means that explaining the techniques of misinformation is one of the key strategies to countering the spread and the negative effects of misinformation. And I found a useful framework for explaining misinformation techniques are the five techniques of science denial: fake experts, that's the one used in the global warming petition project; logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. A key thing to point out, though, is that these techniques are not just five techniques, they're actually categories of techniques. And there are actually a whole range of different fallacies and rhetorical techniques and traits of conspiratorial thinking that are in that taxonomy of denial techniques. Um, and I've been building this taxonomy over the last couple of years, or a number of years, and it's not even comprehensive. There are more I could be adding in there, but these are the main ones found in climate misinformation. So let me jump back again. So after I published the inoculation experiment, this was way back in 2017, the next step for me was, well, what are effective ways to actually explain fallacies? If explaining logical fallacies and rhetorical techniques is a way to neutralize misinformation, practically, how do you do it? And I was introduced to a technique by some critical thinking philosophers who use this technique in their critical thinking classes. They call it parallel arguments. Another way you might call it is logic analogies. But basically, you take the flawed logic, the logical fallacy in some misinformation, and you transplant it into a parallel or analogous situation. And the more extreme or absurd the parallel situation, the more obvious the fallacy. Let me give you some examples. And the power of this parallel argument strategy is uh, it can take abstract logic and make it much more concrete, make it relatable, and even make it entertaining. Um, for me, the light bulb moment was realizing that late night comedians use this technique to debunk misinformation all the time. They would take something that a public figure had said that day and said, well, this person said this argument. That's just like being in this other situation. And then they would use the same logic. And people would laugh. It's entertaining, it's funny, but it also is a very elegant and concrete way to illustrate how an argument is false. Let me give you an example. Because often you hear an argument and think, oh, it doesn't quite sound right, but I can't put my finger on how it's misleading. Here was an argument made in 2016 by then Senator Marco Rubio, who argued that the reason why climate is changing is climate has always been changing. Now, this argument, it rolls off the tongue. It's often used almost as a knee-jerk reaction when climate deniers hear the phrase climate change. They'll just say, oh, climate change. Well, climate's always been changing. But what the argument does is it commits single cause fallacy, assuming that whatever caused something in the past must be the same single cause now. And that single cause fallacy is exactly the same as finding a dead body with a knife sticking out of their back and saying, well, this person must have died of natural causes because people have always died of natural causes, assuming that whatever had caused something in the past must be the same cause now. I'll give you one more example of a parallel argument. Here was an argument made in 2014. No, was it 2015? It was 2015 in response, February 2015. So it was winter. It was very cold in DC. And 2014 had just been announced by scientists as the hottest year on record. And for the record, 2015 beat 2014, and then 2016 beat 2015. So we had three hottest years on record consecutively. But anyway, back in 2015, Senator Inhofe argued that scientists might be saying that we just had the hottest year on record, but Here's a snowball. It's very, very cold out. Essentially arguing, well, global warming can't be happening because it's cold. This logic is the same as arguing at nighttime, it's dark, the sun doesn't exist. Saying it's cold, global warming doesn't exist, it commits anecdote fallacy. You're only looking at your immediate surroundings at that time and place and ignoring the bigger picture. So using parallel arguments or logic analogies are one technique for explaining how arguments can be false. And it doesn't have to be cartoons. It can just be something verbal. Like you hear an argument and you say, well, that's just like saying, um, and then using an analogous situation. But let me just go back to the flick taxonomy, because one of the challenges from a communication or an education point of view is that if the way to neutralize misinformation is to make people aware of these techniques and be able to spot these techniques, the challenge is there are a lot of them. There are a lot of things that people need to learn, and not just become aware of them, but internalize them deeply enough that they can spot them in the wild, spot them on TV or on social media or in conversations. And so I've been thinking about this challenge. How do you help people to internalize these misinformation techniques deeply enough that they can actually spot them in everyday life? There's a book by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he talks about two types of thinking. The first is fast thinking, and this is the vast bulk of our psychology, of our thinking. Fast thinking is our immediate reactions to everything that's happening around us. Mental shortcuts, immediate emotional reactions, our gut instinct. And it happens immediately, straight away, and it's effortless. We just do it without even thinking. It's the vast bulk of what we do, and it's easy. It's effortless thinking. The second type of thinking we do is slow thinking, and this is reasoning through difficult problems. It's something like multiplying a two-digit number by another two-digit number. It's really difficult to do that, and so it requires a lot of thought. Or identifying logical fallacies in arguments. That's another slow thinking task. The challenge is that slow thinking is hard. It requires a lot of cognitive effort. And so we're butting up against this really basic psychological challenge in trying to encourage people to engage with slow thinking. We're capable of it. We're all capable of it, but it's effortful. So we're kind of pushing up against just how our brains are hardwired. However, buried away deep in Kahneman's book, he talks about a third type of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. And this is what happens when an expert does a slow thinking task, but they do it over and over and over again so much that it becomes fast thinking. It's like a heart surgeon who's performed thousands of surgeries so that they can look at a really complicated situation while they're operating, and they can make immediate decisions based on their years of experience. And reading this got me thinking, is there a way that we can get people practicing critical thinking so that that slow thinking task of spotting fallacies can become a fast thinking, effortless task instead? One way that we could do that, achieve that goal, is through games. And so it was actually in 2020, it was during the pandemic that we developed this game, Cranky Uncle, with the purpose of using gameplay elements like collecting points and leveling up and humor and cartoons to incentivize people to practice critical thinking and get better at spotting fallacies. So the game basically goes through the flick fallacies. So you can see the five techniques of science denial here on the right. And what the game does is cranky uncle, who is the science denying cranky uncle that seems to be ubiquitous. Everyone I speak to kind of smiles knowingly when I mention this because we all seem to have either a family member or a friend or an acquaintance that matches that description. Um, an opinionate older person, usually male, sorry guys, um, that that thinks they know better than the world's scientific experts. What this game does is has Cranky Uncle explain the different techniques in the Flick taxonomy, and then the game has you practice critical thinking. It shows you examples of misinformation, and you have to identify what is the technique in each example. And each time you get it right, you collect points, cranky points, and then you level up. Leveling up being Cranky Uncle gets crankier, crankier. So the whole purpose of this is to incentivize people to get further into the game because the more they play, the more they practice critical thinking, and the more that slow thinking, critical thinking becomes fast thinking and quicker and easier at spotting misinformation techniques. The last thing I want to just talk about is the general best practices on countering misinformation. Um, Explaining fallacies is what I've mainly talked about today, and that's a key element to countering misinformation. But we also, ideally, if we have the opportunity, we want to combine explaining fallacies with explaining the facts. And the optimal way to debunk misinformation is using a structure which we call the truth sandwich. It's a sandwich because you want to start and finish with the facts, put the emphasis on the facts. A fact that dislodges and disproves the myth that you're trying to debunk. And remember how earlier I was talking about how facts and myths cancel each other out? In this structure, you have fact and myth, and you have that conflict, you have that tension between fact and myth. The way that you resolve the conflict between fact and myth is you explain the fallacy. That you explain the fallacy that the myth uses to distort the facts. Once people have that, all three elements, fact, myth, fallacy, they can reconcile it. They can understand how the myth can exist at the same time as the facts. And I'll just tease one little thing that we're working on now. This is some research that we're just currently in the process of doing. We're looking at using AI and large language models like ChatGPT to generate debunkings of climate misinformation and the generating a debunking that adopts the truth sandwich format. So the first thing we're going to do, and this will be over the next month or two, is release a tool where you can enter climate misinformation into a web page, and it will spit out a truth sandwich debunking if it's climate misinformation. But if you are curious about this kind of research and want to dig into what we've been doing, we have published a preliminary paper if you're into that kind of thing. So where we describe the AI techniques that we use, as well as the psychological principles that we're trying to bring into this research as well. It's really bringing together computer science and psychological science, because you really need technology and psychology to address problems like misinformation. I'll stop there. I've got lots of links there to the papers that I've mentioned. So I'll also be sharing my slides with Chelsea so that anyone here who wants to get hold of the slides, you're welcome to them. And you can also follow these links if you want. And I think I might have gone a little long. I apologize, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the time we have left.
Right. So as I mentioned at the start, you can either pose your question, raise your hand, and I'll call on you, or if you want to drop your questions in the chat, then we can do that too. And I'm just going to go ahead and acknowledge Bill from New York. He has raised his hand early. So, Bill, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I think that the environmental left has been saying a lot of things that really offend conservatives in general, and a lot of the messaging. The uh, there's a lot of talk of sacrifices, telling people not to have children, telling people to become vegetarians, drive smaller cars, or take public transport, and they're selling a message of massive sacrifice and pain to the public that people don't want to listen to, and it's not a welcome message, and I don't believe it's a necessary message.
Yeah, I would agree. What you bring up is a broader climate communication point. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of psychological research into this, like finding that you don't want to well, firstly, you want to communicate messages that don't alienate or conflict with people's values. It's going to either be ineffective or counterproductive. You've talked about the counterproductiveness. Secondly, that messengers to a specific audience should share the values of that audience. So it's a tricky one, but I think that yeah, we need to well, it really just underscores the importance of sharing some of the findings from climate communication and psychological research, which finds that um, communicating messages that aren't about deprivation, but talk about shared values and some of the positives of climate action, such as the benefits of health benefits of climate action, uh,
Yeah.
work across all audiences. Um, Ed Mayback, again, I keep mentioning him, has done a lot of the formative research on how the health benefits of climate action resonate across all audiences. It's one of the probably few messages that do resonate on both the left and the right. And there are other ways of framing climate change. Um, but the general principle, I think, is co-benefits, talking about the co-benefits of climate action.
I'm going to turn next to Peter Garrett from my home state of Maine. Peter, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks a lot. You've explained a whole lot, and I and several other people on this call, no doubt, are attending Citizens Climate Lobby's conservative um, climate leadership conference next week. And I thank you for the health benefits. Um, um, what should I say? A guiding star, perhaps. Are there others that you could recommend that we, in the conversations that we will no doubt have with the Republican members of Congress?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's such a broad question, and it's a little outside my lane. I've tended to focus on the misinformation lane, but bringing your question into my lane, I guess, in a way. Um, One thing I didn't talk about in my presentation, but which is relevant, is that back in the early 90s, in that timeline when misinformation started to really flourish in the early 1990s, a lot of the misinformation came from conservative think tanks. And I really conservative think tanks at that point in time really had a choice. They could have either in response to the problem of climate change, proposed conservative, market-friendly solutions to climate change, or they could have denied the problem needs solving in the first place. And I think it's a great tragedy of history that they chose the second option. They chose to cast doubt on the science rather than promote their own solutions to climate change. So uh, I guess maybe an answer to your question is promoting, like, solving climate change isn't a pure domain of the left. There are conservative solutions, um, and Bob Inglis is a much more qualified person to talk about those than myself.
Well, and I can just add to that too, Peter, that one thing we find effective is anytime you can bring in really direct impacts from the district or the state, or
Yes.
opportunities in the district or the state that might be presented by solutions like clean energy solutions and stuff. So
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you. Well, no doubt we'll be mentioning that most of the money for the Inflation Reduction Act put into that act went to Republican congressional districts and states.
yeah,
Yeah,
80%. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and one
Uh,
other general principle, just following on from what you just said, is a general climate communication principle is, you need to really have two elements to your message, problem and solution. If it's just too much of one or too much of the other, it's an imbalanced argument. If it's all just climate change the problem, that can actually have a paralyzing effect on people. And
yes,
if it's all just kind of roses and solutions, that can underplay the severity and the urgency of the issue. But if it's a balanced message that says we have a problem, but we also have solutions, that's a more holistic way to frame it. And then I think, yeah, localizing both the problems and the solutions is a really effective way to make it tangible. So talking about here is a local impact of climate change, and here's how it affects this region, and ideally find ways that it is affecting it now, because climate change isn't just something that's going to happen decades in the future, it's happening right now. But also here are things that people are doing now to address it, and talk about success stories.
my friend Larry Howe in Plano, you want to pose your question?
Yeah. Hi, John. The misinformation landscape kind of always seems to evolve, and we have a new head of the U.S. Department of Energy here in the U.S., a guy named Chris Wright, and he was recently speaking in the UK with a new set or an evolved set of misinformation. And I was just curious if you can point us to any references. He kind of basically said, Net zero 2050 is a sinister goal. It's a terrible goal, the aggressive pursuit of it. And right now you're sitting in a country, and he was talking in the UK, you've aggressively pursued that goal and it's delivered zero benefits. And it's cost, the cost have been tremendous. So, we're not only doing crazy things in the US, we're trying to help convince other English speaking countries around the world to follow our lead. So have you seen anything recently that helps, start us thinking about how we can counter that kind of conversation? Thanks.
I wasn't aware of that, Larry, and you discouraged me a little that that's happening because, yeah, I had seen the new head of the Department of Energy, like a video clip of him on Fox News using some very old debunked myths, like, really stuff from the 1990 type arguments. But the fact that he's actually arguing to other countries, not just talking in a domestic politics context, but actually encouraging other or discouraging other countries from climate action, that's very dangerous, because what we really need to adequately solve climate change is collective action on an international scale. We need countries cooperating. So if you have a major country or one of the leading countries trying to slow momentum on climate action, that's discouraging. As for his arguments, I mean, they are, we've heard the cost of climate action is worse than the problem. We've heard that since the 90s. That was something, one of the very first arguments that Riley Dunlap and Aaron McCright document back in, yeah, the early 1990s. That was one of the three arguments that they were using then. So it's an old argument, probably with a new skin.
Yeah, that's what I think it kind of turned out to be. And I think, as things were the clean energy had been more expensive. Time has passed and it's now less expensive, and it's actually less expensive. So, it falls into that, or the counter to it may be, the cost of inaction now is more than action. And maybe that's what we need to start weaving in to those conversations to help counter that, you know, things advance. So let's not, be stuck in the 20 or 30 years ago. Thanks.
Well, just to follow on, like just to continue to answer your question, what you bring up is kind of a challenge for anyone debunking misinformation, particularly climate misinformation, which is you often hear a series of arguments, and there are like 12 things wrong with it. So where do you start? Like there's the inaction is more expensive than action. There's the he talked about you mentioned urgency. There's no urgency. Well, we are long past the time of urgency, and we've actually blown past the opportunity to restrict global warming to 1.5. So now we're kind of backpedaling. Can we restrict it to 2 degrees? Like even that seems ambitious. So um, we are not only urgent, we're kind of sirens blaring urgent. It's but yeah, there's a number of things wrong, and often you'll find when you have to respond to these kinds of arguments, there's such a buffet of fallacies to choose from. What do you choose? How do you come up with a coherent response without just overwhelming people? Generally, the approach I take there is to the general rule of debunking, or the golden rule of debunking, as the Heath brothers put it in their book Made to Stick. The golden rule of debunking is fight sticky myths with stickier facts. So what you want to do is identify what is the key fact, the sticky fact that I want to dislodge this set of misinformation arguments. In your situation, probably the inaction is more expensive than action. That might be the sticky fact, and maybe there's a way to there's a statistic like I forget the exact numbers, but I've seen graphs where the cost of inaction is like 10 times greater than action, that kind of thing. So there could be a sticky number like that, in the same way that 97% consensus was a sticky number.
What was the name?
I want to let Max ask his questions. We just have a few more minutes, and he's been very patient. So, Larry, I'm going to follow up with you. I think you should write an op-ed on this topic.
Yes.
And so I'll turn over to Max from Big Sky, Montana.
What was the name of the book, real quick, John, that you just mentioned? Sorry.
It was Made to Stick
Thank you.
by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, the Heath brothers. And it's generally about how to make your messages sticky. The key thing to learn from it is they have an acronym, a very sticky acronym, SUCCESS. If you want your message to stick, you want to tick as many of these boxes as possible. Simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional story. If you can shape your facts, your communication to try to address as many of these, especially simple, then you're more likely to have a message that goes viral or sticks with people, is more likely to be remembered.
Max, close us up.
Yep. Thanks to Republican for such an informative series, having this 2-part, and thank you, John, for sharing your work. Really, really insightful. I have 2 questions. One, you had a chart that showed the consensus by party back to 1997. Does the chart go back further? In the early 80s, Secretary of State George Shultz acknowledged that there was a need for action, and he's actually the one who came up with carbon pricing. And I was part of a group that's Republicans for the Environment going about talking on that. And it was the Democrats who were disagreeing at that point in time. So for me, it's really when might the lines have crossed in that chart? Question number 1. Question number 2, are there any scientifically reviewed publications showing climate change is not happening?
All right. Question 1, not on this particular measure of public perception of scientific consensus. However, I do recall, and I took it out. Sorry, I should have included it in the slideshow, but I do recall another slide. In fact, what I might do is I might just insert it into this PowerPoint before I send it on to Republic again to share. It was a measure of trust in science, and it showed a similar polarization, but it also, and it went back, I think, to the 70s. And I seem to recall it even had Democrats lower, like the lines crossed back in the 70s or 80s. So it seemed to describe exactly what you were describing. So yeah, so I'll include that, I think, in the slides just as an Easter egg for anyone who gets hold of the PowerPoint afterwards. As for the second question, so yeah, we found in our study 97% consensus, which meant that there was 2% of papers that disagreed with human-caused global warming and 1% who were uncertain about global warming. And amongst those 2% that disagreed, there were key elements, and we've actually written a separate paper, lead authored by John Abraham, where we look at some of these papers and ask that question, I think, which is what you're wondering, what's going on with these dissenting papers? We find a couple of things. Firstly, there's no coherent theme or theory amongst these dissenting papers. They're not presenting a consistent, coherent explanation of what's happening. They're just throwing mud to the wall. They're just throwing out lots of different ideas. But secondly, and I think probably more importantly, it's actually a little bit like what I talked about today. We expose the rhetorical techniques and the fallacies in these arguments. They use fallacies like hasty generalization or improper extrapolation or cherry picking or misrepresentation in order to distort the data, distort the science, and come to these false conclusions. So yeah, there's a paper by John Abraham that looks at this, and another paper, I think, by Rasmus Benestad. We've done two papers that have more examined these papers, these dissenting papers. But the gist of it is that they tend to use these same rhetorical techniques that I've been describing today.
Well, before we go, I just do want to bring up skeptical science because we've had so many people mentioning it in the chat both tonight and at last week's webinar. Skeptical science is a wonderful tool that you can access both online, and there is an app that pretty much, John, you cover, you're talking about myths, how that you have the sticky myths and you have to have stickier facts. To me, skeptical science has all the sticky myths, and then it gives you those stickier facts, and it actually gives you the sort of the easy, 10,000-foot level response, the intermediate level, and then if you really want to dive down and get into the weeds, it gives you the most complicated level. And this website first came across my radar in like 2009, I think it was, or maybe even 8. And I was out to dinner with a friend at a very nice restaurant in Alexandria. And we ran into some friends of my friend, and they asked us to have after dinner drinks with them. And we were, and they asked me what I did. And my friend's, she's my best hype woman. So she's like, oh, Chelsea's one of the preeminent experts on climate policy in Washington, D.C., blah, blah, blah. And they're like, well, climate change isn't real. And I thought they were kidding at first. Turned out they weren't. And their big excuse was that, well, Jupiter is warming and it's fine. So the Earth should be warming. And I had nothing to say to this. So, except I got very emotional, etc. So the next day I asked a friend of mine who was a climate scientist how I should have answered. And he said, well, you should have skeptical science on your phone so that you can answer those really random sticky myths when they come your way. So I highly encourage people who encounter some of those sticky myths in their lives to get the app or have the website on your bookmarks. But anyway, I've kept everybody over. I'm going to tell Angela I failed to keep us running on time. Thank you all so much. My colleague Angela, who couldn't be here tonight because her daughter had a musical performance, she will be sending a follow-up with the recording. We'll have John's PowerPoint. And if any other questions pop up, you can send them to me, Chelseea republicen.org, or to Angela in response to that message. And she will also include last week's recording for those of you who just signed up for tonight and missed last week. So thank you, John Cook, for riveting evening discussion. It's evening where I am anyway, morning, I guess, or daytime for you. And thank you all for joining. Please stay tuned for our next quarter's webinar to TBD.
Thanks, John.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
John,
Thanks, everyone.
Dr. Cook.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.